If you've been sitting there thinking, I don't know if I'm ready for the meds journey yet, or your kiddo just can't tolerate them, listen up. NeuroNeeds was created by a medical geneticist, board-certified pediatrician, and ADHD dad who hit the same wall when his own kiddo couldn't handle stimulants. He built a science-backed line of nutritional support to help fill the gaps where meds just can't. So if treatment feels scary or you're not sure where to start, NeuroNeeds might just be the middle ground your family's been looking for. Learn more at neuroneeds.com. Okay, parents, buckle up because today's episode is one of those that's gonna make you stop mid-sip of your cold coffee and go, wait, what? Today, I'm talking with Dr. Pejman Katiraei. Yes, super fancy name, but trust me, he's the real deal. He's a pediatrician who doesn't just slap a diagnosis on your kiddo and send you home with a pamphlet. He actually digs into the why. We're talking about how the world around our kids, the food that they eat, the crap in their environment, even how their little nervous systems are wired can play into ADHD, autism, anxiety, and all that super fun stuff that has us up Googling at 2 a.m. And here's the kicker. Dr. K didn't just learn about these diagnoses in his medical books. He actually brings this unique experience from his own struggles during his adolescent years. Basically, this is not your typical doctor chat. This is the kind of conversation that makes you rethink how you look at your kids' meltdowns and quirks. And honestly, it might just help you breathe a little easier knowing that it's not all on you. Dr. K, welcome to Chaos and Caffeine.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I told you a little bit off air, but I am ashamed to admit I never related the gut to ADHD until I joined the Facebook mommy groups and I was informed. So I am excited for this conversation.
Well, I'm happy to share what I know. And, honestly, half of what I have learned has actually been through the parents and, them bringing something up or, we try something and something completely new and unexpected than what I was expecting happened where, you support the mitochondria and all of a sudden the child's sensory issues start improving. So for me, this learning journey has been something that I feel the families that I've worked with have really contributed a lot. And, there are times that it's very clear to me that I learn more from my families than I do from any conference or, quote unquote expert that I'm listening to. So, yeah, we're in the same boat.
I love that. Before I take you through all of my 1,000 questions, do you mind telling our audience who you are?
Yeah. So my name is Pejman Katiraei. I'm a integrative board certified pediatrician. I finished my residency in 2006, so I'm kind of dating myself here a little bit. So I've been in practice almost 20 years, got into holistic medicine over 17 years ago, and I've just, been at it. And, for me, this world of holistic medicine, integrative medicine, whatever you want to call it, to me it's just medicine when you remove the boundaries and limitations of what you're able to think and what you're able to use for treatments. And I think in medicine, a lot of times we don't ask enough questions, even in the holistic medicine world, right? There are wonderful providers who have amazing hearts, who want to do good. But part of what I see in all domains is people get very content with, well, I learned this information, this is what is, and this is how it is, period, end of story. And I think that that's unfortunate because no one's God. Like, I certainly haven't figured it all out, but having that curiosity and always asking why, like, why is this happening? And when you get to that layer, well, why is this happening, right? And that to me is the blessing and joy of medicine. And at the end of the day, these whys help bring better understanding that ultimately helps more children, because sadly, there are more kids who are struggling today than ever before.
Unfortunately, I agree. And is that removing the boundaries the reason for your redirection into holistic medicine?
Yeah, it is. And, when you get into whatever field, and, they say, well, in conventional medicine, it's just like diseases just happen, right? You end up getting colitis, and colitis just happens. Thyroid disease just happens. And autism just happens. Anxiety disorders in 6 year olds just happen. And there's nothing in the body that just happens, right? The body doesn't do something or create something or manifest a problem unless there's a reason. And I believe it is really our responsibility to find out what those reasons are. And when we can't figure them out, we should be humble enough to say, God, we really don't know what the hell is going on. And let's start with, we don't know what the hell is going on, and start asking questions and trying to learn. And I think, when you approach it like that, like a purely scientific kind of mindset where everything is fair game, science is science, right? There's no attachment to the data, and either something proves to be correct and effective or not. And that's what I try to do in my practice, be as objective as possible, not get attached to ideas or theories or whatever, and try to do the best I can to ultimately bring forth the most effective, model to help these families that I serve.
So enlighten me, take me through the whole gut inflammation. No, I'm just kidding. Like I said, it's very new to me. I was unaware that mold or environmental factors could exacerbate ADHD symptoms until I joined the mom groups. So I am curious to know how and why that happens, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, when we step, I think it's worth stepping back and looking at these constellation of findings that we see in children, right? So the impulsivity, the hyperactivity, the fears and phobias. So there are kids that just have these irrational reactions where they freak out when they go into environments, they get overwhelmed. A lot of times with that, weird sensory findings, kids that can't wear certain types of clothing, kids who get overwhelmed in certain loud and crowded environments. And then, as you kind of dig into it, usually these kids have some type of restrictive eating where they're very quote unquote picky. But when you ask, is it just the kid is being a little bit of a pain in the butt? No, they're actually really restrictive in their eating. They sometimes have sleep issues. So there's like this constellation of findings that we see, whether we call the child ADD, ADHD, or, somewhere on the spectrum, or we give them a label of anxiety disorder. But labels aside, there's just this pattern that keeps showing up. And that pattern is ultimately a reflection of inflammation. And inflammation in the nervous system essentially tweaks the biochemistry and the physiology of the brain in such a way where you get these kinds of outward manifestations. And I believe, one of the most telltale signs of this inflammation is fear and phobias, which also sometimes shows up as anger and aggression, right? Because if you go and ask in the world of psychology, where does aggression and anger come from? It's fear. Fear drives anger and aggression. So a lot of times we see these patterns where either kids are super, super anxious and just freak out over little things, right? To the point where the parents look and they're like, what prompted you to flip out? There was nothing there. Or the child is acting in this very odd, aggressive fashion, except it's not the child. It's almost like they're possessed by something, and that possession is the inflammation. It tweaks the chemistry where their sensory pathways get all wonky. So the way they perceive certain things, whether it's sight or smell or sound or movement, which causes them to get all hyperactive, these are all outward reflections of inflammation. And these are conversations that we don't have often enough. And that's why I'm so grateful to be here, because like this inflammatory response, I would say, is an epidemic. Now we're seeing this in more kids in more severe ways than even 5 years ago. And sadly, it's affecting so many kids in just really awful ways.
Can you describe how, outside of phobias and fears, that it may manifest in kiddos with ADHD?
Yeah. So, if we ask what is ADHD, right? Well, the kid is hyperactive. They're typically inattentive, right? They lose focus, they lose attention, and with that comes distractibility. But if you dig deeper, a lot of times what also shows up is they have processing issues, right? They struggle with math, they struggle with processing information. And we just clump this into, well, this is just inattention or with that some element of hyperactivity, and we think it's a dopamine issue, so we'll throw the kids on Ritalin because dopamine and Ritalin fix everything. And it's true, these psychotropic stimulants typically do improve attention, and for some kids they're game changers. And there are some kids that I tell the parents right off the bat, like, just give your kid the medication, be on with your life. But there are kids whose struggles are far more than the child is just a little inattentive. And part of what happens is when, for instance, you say, okay, well, if dopamine is involved, what the hell is causing the entire dopamine pathway to get wonky, right? To drive inattention. And if you or your readers ever type in microglial, so MICROGLIAL, microglial activation and dopamine, there are actually some really fascinating studies that talk about how these sentinels of the brain, so the microglia are basically one of the primary immune cells of the brain, whose job it is to protect the brain. When these sentinels all of a sudden start tripping up, aka inflammation, they actually start disrupting the dopamine pathways. So dopamine receptors, the dopamine synapses, the dopamine neurons, like the dopaminergic neurons, all of these pathways actually start becoming disrupted. So one of the things that shows up is this inattention because dopamine is not functioning well. These kids have hyperactivity. Well, where does hyperactivity come from? If you talk to occupational therapists that are grounded in sensory integration, they say, well, hyperactivity is typically grounded in the vestibular system, right? Our balance control centers of the brain control if we can sit still and pay attention, or if we have this constant need to fidget and move and rock and so forth. Okay, well, if that's true, then what disrupts the vestibular systems? Well, it turns out that the microglia, when they get activated, start dumping out histamine. And histamine disrupts the vestibular system, which then causes the hyperactivity, right? So there's all of these things that start showing up. Histamine also influences impulsivity. So you get these weird patterns of the kid doesn't think and they just jump and they act and they talk out. And if you distill this all down, yes, there are biochemical issues at play, but what is underneath that? And there are some very well done studies that suggest that inflammation is ultimately one of the root causes of ADHD and various learning disabilities.
So you mentioned picky eaters, which hits home for me in ways that I cannot even describe. So how is a picky eater affecting our inflammation?
Think of a time when you had way too much coffee, right? You were just drinking coffee, you weren't even paying attention, and all of a sudden, like, half the day is gone and you were not even hungry, right? So coffee influences glutamate, which indirectly can influence appetite. It turns out that histamine is one of the most powerful regulators of appetite. There's an interesting study that was looking at, have you heard of leptin?
I have.
Okay, so leptin also modulates appetite. It turns out that histamine is the chemical that influences the effects of leptin. So if you can imagine, like, everyone thinks of leptin as the appetite control hormone, it turns out that histamine is the thing that actually creates the effects of leptin, which kind of is a reflection of how critically important histamine is to appetite. So when histamine is elevated, not only do you get the hyperactivity and impulsivity, essentially the appetite control centers of the brain get really wonky, and appetite essentially, I don't want to say it gets shut down, but it gets really, really suppressed to the point where some of these kids, I genuinely believe, cannot sense their own hunger. And that's why parents are constantly, trying to chase them around and shovel food in their mouth because that kid is just not
Yeah.
eating. But if you add to that, this is the part that gets so interesting. If you add to that, well, is it just their appetite or is their experience of food also different? And there are some kids that are older and were able to articulate it, and they say the experience of food, certain foods feel gross. And I think like that's the perfect way to reflect what a lot of other kids who can't articulate it feel. When these kids go and eat one type of chicken nugget and one type of mac and cheese and maybe some pizza and maybe some peanut butter and jelly, there's a reason why they do that. And that's because these salty, semi-crunchy foods are really the only foods that feel semi-decent. I don't think it even feels good to them. It's just the experience is tolerable. So they start eating these foods because everything else from a sensory standpoint, whether it's the smell of it, the feel of the food in their mouth, just grosses them out. And on top of that, they're not hungry. So why would you want to eat if food feels and tastes gross to you and you weren't even that hungry to begin with?
And what are we to do about that? You know those nights when you're up at 2 a.m. Googling, why did my child blow up over nothing? Or how do I explain instructions that don't take off like a rocket? Meet Dr. Lorian Phillips, a clinical psychologist since 1995 and in the ADHD trenches with families since 2013. She isn't just someone who studies kids. She's raising them, parenting them, figuring this stuff out live. Dr. Phillips runs what may feel like your dream support system, an ADHD parenting course she started in 2013, plus private consults to help you read your child's wiring instead of fighting against it. She's spoken at schools from nursery to high school. She teaches ADHD families emotional regulation and all the skills that we need to feel successful and not broken. If you are overwhelmed by the constant, did I say that wrong? Moments, knowing there is a way forward with understanding, empathy, structure, and celebration, Dr. Lorian Phillips is someone you'll want in your corner. For more, check her out at adhdmanagement.co.za or click the link in the episode show notes to connect with her from wherever you are.
The really cool part, and why I've been running down these rabbit holes is I have some kids where once we modulate their immune response, calm down the microglia, reduce histamine, reduce inflammation. I've had kids that literally that there's one of them that comes to mind where the parents were only able to get him to eat a select amount of pureed foods and some basically shakes. And I think he was eating like one type of pasta, period. Like if you can imagine how extreme that was. And as his inflammation calmed down, literally within 3 or 4 weeks, he started eating like 5 or 8 new foods. I've had kids that like were the extreme picky eaters, chicken nuggets, whatever. All of a sudden they're taking a bite of salmon, they're eating a bite of broccoli. So ultimately we have to stand back and say, what is causing this child's inflammation? Now, first understand that root cause. And in some of these kids, there are these over-the-counter enzymes, and everyone should talk to their doctor just because, this guy on a podcast said something, you shouldn't go and run and do it. But there are these DAO enzymes, diamine oxidase enzymes. There are several companies that sell them. Diamine oxidase is an enzyme that's found in the gut, but when there's gut inflammation, that enzyme essentially becomes inactivated. It gets destroyed. So histamine starts building up in the gut, which then ultimately makes its way to the brain. So sometimes by giving these histamine enzymes, you're able to break down the histamine in the gut, which can help improve the child's sleep, improve their appetite, sometimes helps them calm down, helps them reduce their sensory issues. I have some kids that are so bad off where we use pharmaceuticals like cromolyn or ketotifen, which are basically the same thing on steroids. But there's so many options, like that's the beauty of this. There's so many things we can do once we get to a point of saying, you know what, this is what's going on in this poor kid. There's a reason why they're doing all of these things and behaving the way they are. And once we understand that, it's like, okay, what tool is the best tool for this child?
Outside of the supplements, is there things that we can do as parents that will help also?
Yeah. One of the things is being mindful of the child's diet. So I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of, gluten and dairy and some of these pro-inflammatory foods. What not all people realize are high histamine foods. So bone broth, for instance, which everyone equates to as the perfect gut healing, food, which it is for healthy people. But for people who have histamine intolerance, it turns out that bone broth is like kryptonite. I have one family that I could just thought of. Child was on the spectrum, was doing fantastic, doing great, socializing, happy, everything was going in the right direction. And all of a sudden, like everything got weird. Started having sleep issues, started becoming more sensitive, and I was like, what has changed? What happened? And they're like, we don't know. I'm like, did anything change in the diet? And they're like, well, we started bone broth to fix his gut. I'm like it's that crazy. Fermented foods, sauerkraut, pickles, all of the stuff. And if anyone types in high histamine foods, there are so many foods that we equate as good gut healing foods. But for these kids, it turns out these foods actually trigger more histamine. So that's a simple trick that families can use to, potentially help their child.
So I'm afraid of the answer. How would we know except on a one case by case basis? Is there a way for us to maybe recognize some of these and pinpoint it, or do we need outside expert help?
In terms of identifying the foods,
In terms of identifying if we're giving them bone broth and something drastically changes, or if we see something already happening, is there a way for us to recognize what's going on, or do we need another set of eyes?
well, I think there are things that families can do for sure. And, part of why I'm always, happy to have these discussions is I believe empowering parents with information first is the most important thing. So, if a child is hyperactive and they're sensitive and they've got some sleep issues and they're kind of picky, and they've got, intolerance of some clothing, I think doing a 1 or 2 week trial of a low histamine diet and then possibly, under the guidance of someone, maybe some of these enzymes is a great place to start. These are simple, inexpensive, safe things that anyone can do. Risk of harm is, I don't want to say impossible, but it's extremely low. And usually within 2 or 3 weeks, it's like, oh God, wow, he's getting better. He's sleeping better. She's eating better. Her kind of sensory stuff has calmed down, in which case then it's like, oh, okay, something worked, right? So there's definitely things that people can do.
That is reassuring. I'm glad to hear that. I have a picky eater who also has ADHD, clearly, that's why I'm here, and who struggles with anxiety. So I think that it would be definitely worth my while to start this journey for him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In some of these cases, when there's also patterns of anxiety, there are a few supplements out there. One of them is called Neuroprotec, Protek. So there's this brilliant doc who I've become friends with. His name is Dr. Theo Herides, and he's kind of the mast cell king of, this entire domain. He's published a ton on this. He has a supplement called Neuroprotec, which essentially the primary ingredient is luteolin, which also happens to be a really powerful mast cell stabilizer, which is where this histamine and inflammation comes from. There's another product called Mirica, and I have no affiliation with any of these companies, Mirica. That has luteolin plus this egg fat derivative called PEA that also helps reduce inflammation. And sometimes when you take the DAO enzymes with the Mirica or Neuroprotec, it can really complement one another and help even more. And specifically in patterns of anxiety, sometimes that could be helpful.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
In researching you for today's interview, not only did I get nervous at your vast skills, but I see you all over the internet saying how COVID and mold and other external factors are exacerbating symptoms. Is that due to inflammation and how they're affecting our system?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um, what I see is all of the stuff that we have released into our environment, the plastics, the pesticides, the chemicals, the metals, all kinds of, persistent pollutants created a lot of susceptibility in the kids. COVID came along and that was just like unleashing one more, significant pro-inflammatory toxin, if you want to consider it. And I believe COVID eroded the resiliency of our children even further. And if you look at some of the data just on autism, for instance, over the last 8 years, 5 to 8 years, there has been another jump in the rates of autism. And I think that that has to do with what COVID did to ultimately the gut, the immune system, the mitochondria, and that created another layer of susceptibility. What I see now is when these kids are impacted by any other external factor, and as you pointed out, mold is one of the things that I have become most concerned about. It's present in 1 in 3 homes in high humidity areas where, flooding is sometimes an issue. It's 1 in 2. So it's not uncommon. It's extremely common, except families don't even know to pay attention, right? They noticed a little, spot in their ceiling, but they would never think like, well, that spot in the ceiling is the reason why my kid has, ADHD or learning disabilities or autism or sleep issues or whatever,
Yeah.
right? No one would ever make that connection, right? Except that little spot is usually a reflection of a whole lot more mold that's sitting on the other side of the drywall. And, when you ask, well, why is this happening? Well, we did something not very intelligent about 50, 60 years ago when we introduced drywall or gypsum board. And gypsum board drywall has mold spores embedded into the paper that basically wraps the calcium. So it's like having a chia pet in your home, except that chia pet is mold, and you just add water and you get mold. Uh, so it gets missed on regular testing. So people even think about it and they bring some, inspector that has good intentions, but they're not testing very thoroughly. So they tell the family, oh, there's no mold in your home, you're fine, right? And it's missed on testing. A lot of even holistic providers, unfortunately, are not yet well trained enough to know how to identify it. So they'll do basic testing, some urine testing. Oh, this looks fine. There's nothing there, and then they go searching for everything else. So there is a lot of opportunity for us to make changes. And I will say, once families find it and treat it, the most amazing part of this is the transformations that are possible are sometimes mind blowing. The kid that had such severe ADHD and learning disabilities where they were basically about to get kicked out of school, right? They couldn't learn, etc. A year later becomes one of the top students and all their learning disabilities are pretty much gone. Yeah. Do they have some inattention? Yeah. Could a tiny dose of Ritalin help that? Yeah. But it's almost like the child's brain reboots and there's a new brain with a new processing system that's there. I've had kids with extreme anxiety disorders, like the poor kids that can't leave the house. They're constantly having panic attacks. A year later, they're at school, making friends, going on, the school bus by themselves. They don't want the mom around because they want to be cool, right? And it's these things where it's almost unimaginable until you're actually able to witness it for yourself.
I had no idea. I can't believe that. I mean, I assume, we don't know the long-term effects of COVID yet, but mold, I mean, wow.
Yeah, it's almost a little difficult to imagine. And there was a period where 8 years ago, I was like, yeah, this can't be that real until I started looking into it and I started researching it. And then I started taking care of families. And then I got to a point where like I started finding it so often that I thought I was actually becoming delusional until my mentor, Dr. Neil Nathan, is like, no, Pejman, welcome to my world. But it's sad because these are the things that we're not talking about, right? We're not looking for, we're not aware of. So we medicate the kids, we do all of these things to them, and one of the primary root causes just gets totally overlooked.
And so you said there is testing that we could do that, well, someone well informed could do and would know what to look for and find that.
Absolutely. Yeah. There are urine tests. So the urine mold toxin tests that are relatively easy to order. Their accuracy is not perfect. So I'd say at least a third of the time they can miss something. And then they also get impacted by the foods that people eat. There are some blood tests. One of them is called MyMycoLab. So MyMyCoLab. No affiliation with them. So my MycoLab actually looks for immune reactions against the mold toxins, which increases the specificity of it, right? Where it's like, well, God, if your immune system is tripping up, by the toxins that are there, chances are this poor kid is being exposed or has been exposed. The blood testing, if the families can afford it and they can poke their kid, I find to be the most sensitive way to look to see if a child has had exposure. And, the tricky thing is, and why I said has been exposed, is I've had kids where everything started in one home, child really started having issues, family moved out of the home, they're in their current home, but the struggles are continuing. And this is where, the conversation of the gut comes in, because a lot of times these toxins really mess up the gut. And then the gut becomes essentially a continuous source of inflammation and toxicity, even though they're no longer in the environment.
Interesting. Sometimes I feel like having a kiddo with ADHD, I need another degree or something to help me figure out this kid because I learn something new every day. Okay, Chaos Fam, if you're in full back to school mode and wondering what on earth to pack for your sensory seeking, fidget loving, easily distracted kiddo, well, Play Therapy Supply has us covered. We're talking fidgets and sensory tools, discreet classroom friendly options like spiky finger rings, putty, and handheld fidgets that actually help kids focus without becoming a classroom distraction. Calming corner supplies, think weighted lap pads, emotion cards, and sand trays, perfect for teachers or parents building a reset spot. Games and activities, social skills, card decks, conversation starters, and therapeutic games that sneak in learning while your child just thinks they're having fun. And yes, they've got the classic therapy staples from sand and miniatures to art supplies, all designed for both classrooms and home use. Basically, it's your one-stop shop for tools that help kids self-regulate, connect, and thrive during the chaotic back-to-school season. So, head on over to playtherapysupply.com and check out their back-to-school essentials, and a huge thanks to Play Therapy Supply for making this school year a little less overwhelming for all of us. So you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I've only heard it twice on this podcast, and that's mitochondria. Can you tell me the link? The other specialist who came on and mentioned it was Dr. Richard Bowles, who is a wonderful scientist and board-certified pediatrician, and it all went straight over my head because he's so brilliant. I had no clue.
I love Dr. Bowles. I'm actually friends with him, and he has definitely been one of my teachers, and he has helped open my eyes to many things that I wasn't aware of. In my experience, one of the nastiest toxins for the mitochondria is mold. And when I say mold, it's important to highlight that it's not just the mold and the mold toxins. It's if you can imagine like a big block party, right? There's the neighborhood party 500 people show up, right? And people of all different races and, color. That is what happens when there's a water issue or dampness. You get all kinds of molds, so multiple different species and strains. You get gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. And it turns out that these bacteria themselves are producing gnarly toxins that are highly, highly inflammatory. So there's this thing called a bacterial endotoxin. So it's a toxin that bacteria make that happens to trigger horrendous amounts of inflammation in the nervous system. And just through inhalation, they've taken poor mice and they've, exposed them to this stuff. And then they've done awful things to them to look to see how much inflammation they had in their brain. And it wasn't a pretty picture. The other thing, going back to the mitochondria, is the gram-positive bacteria. They have these names called actinos. They produce this funky little toxin that happens to essentially derail the mitochondria. So if you can imagine the mitochondria is like a little conveyor belt. I don't know if I'm dating myself here, but there's like this segment of I Love Lucy where there's a conveyor belt, right? And they're putting stuff in the boxes, and then the conveyor belt gets all screwed up and everything kind of goes sideways, right?
Yeah.
When the mitochondria are functioning properly and appropriately, this conveyor belt, this assembly process is moving flawlessly. And you get fantastic energy, great focus, great processing. The brain is sharp. Everything is spot on. Imagine these toxins start messing with this entire conveyor belt. And now the entire production line is messed up and everything, like one part of it works, one part of it doesn't, one part of it gets kinked up, everything starts backing up. These toxins essentially do the same to the mitochondria and can induce a mitochondrial error, if you want to say, or mitochondrial inefficiency. They call it a mitochondropathy, which is a fancy term to say it all goes upside down. And when that happens, part of what shows up in a lot of the kids that show up with these more severe forms of ADHD and anxiety, what they also have is kind of their low energy. They wake up tired. They're kind of crabby all the time. They sleep 9 hours, but for whatever god-awful reason, that doesn't recharge them, right? They kind of have brain fog. They can't think too clearly. They can't process information well. And it's like everything is just kind of mucked up. It's like there's sludge everywhere, right? Imagine an engine with sludge, right? It kind of works, but it doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
That's a similar thing that happens when these or other toxins, and it could be glyphosates, it could be heavy metals, it could be other stuff, muck up the works of the mitochondria. And when that happens, on top of what we talked about, the mitochondria, because they become a key piece, and this is one of the things Dr. Bowles highlighted to me, because they actually regulate the immune system. The immune system itself gets wonky. So it's like you've got this snowball effect where one thing does another, and then the snowball gets bigger, and then next thing you know, you've got this gigantic beast rolling down the hill.
And to treat that, I apologize if you said it earlier. It's just an individual basis of supplements that could regulate all of that.
Yeah, so, part of my practice is first figuring out what the heck caused this, right? Because let's say you've got pretty gnarly amounts of mold in your home, dampness or water damage. In those cases, trying to put out the fire and build up the mitochondria is, trying to swim upstream, except you're swimming up the Grand Canyon. So not to say you can't make progress, but sometimes the force of the water is so strong that trying to swim up against that current is a little bit difficult. There are many things we can do to support the mitochondria. And, one of the things, again, no affiliation with them, like I give my kids Spectrum Needs. My wife takes it. I use it in my practice all the time because when it works so well. And when I say works, like kids who are highly toxic and highly inflamed, they are generally not ready for it. But once the inflammation calms down, the toxicity goes away. Generally, they do really well. And all of a sudden, it's like the brain lights up and like the lights turn bright. And all of a sudden, families are like, God, his eyes are so much brighter. Their eyes are more clear. And that's just a reflection of the vitality that has improved.
Mm.
And, the genius that Dr. Bowles is, like, if you actually sit down and look at how he made it, like literally he went through every single biochemical pathway and he's like, okay, well, we need this much for this, that much for that. And this genius created this perfect cocktail that happens to taste decent to support all of this.
He really is a genius. I mean, he really is. He changed my life because he came on the podcast and he's so knowledgeable. But the one thing that struck home for me was he said that his kiddo took the stimulant meds and it didn't work. In a sense that he couldn't eat and it threw off everything else in his life. And that is our story. So to have an alternative to that stimulant med and still know that Dr. Bowles' children made it to college and are successful was life-changing for me. So other than possibly supplements and getting out of the house with the mold, what else are we doing with our kids that we can have control over with the outside environmental factors?
You know, I want to go back to the mold thing because I see so many families that are working so hard to make sure their child's diet is organic and it's clean, and they're particular about what pans they use, what oils they use. They're doing all of the right things.
Yeah.
But they're not aware of what's happening to the air inside their home. If you have the equivalent of a chain smoker in your child's wall, and that chain smoker is constantly releasing toxins that are influencing your child's health, unfortunately, all of these other important things that you're doing become not as helpful.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I would like to empower all families to consider is if they look at this and say, gosh, this is my kid. Gosh, this is, perhaps happening to us. Do a simple home screen. And also no affiliation with this company. There's a company called The Dust Test. It's a $270 test, a little swifter. I tell my families, just don't clean your home for a week and a half. They have instructions on how to collect the sample, ship it off. And if it comes back and you're like, holy smokes, like we may have mold, then you need to talk to someone to have it checked, because to me, this is probably one of the most significant things that we can control. And like in my private practice, I would say hands down, the number one thing that I do to make sure the kids in my practice stay healthy is to make sure that the air that they're breathing inside their homes, when they're sleeping, they're playing, they're doing whatever, is clean. And unfortunately, when there's enough contamination, no air purifier is enough to scrub that amount of toxin out of the air.
Yeah.
So that's where screening the home and checking to make sure that things are as good as we think they are is important.
I can definitely drop that link in the show notes because I'm sure all of our listeners are going to be like, we need to do that just in case.
It's so easy. And like that to me is my wish to bring out easy things that anyone can do either by themselves or with any provider that can really make a difference. Getting rid of the high histamine foods, trying some of those basic supplements, making sure the air is clean. You wouldn't believe how much alone that and, doing some of the mitochondrial support, how much of a difference just those very, very basic things can do to help kids thrive.
Yeah. Again, something I did not know until I joined the parent groups, that there was such transformative stuff that I did have in my control that I could do. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Dr. K, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm happy to be here. And, what I want to leave you and, mostly your audience with is a lot of times parents intuitively know there's something else there. Like families know like there's something off. My heart of hearts is telling me there's something going on. I've been told that this is just blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about it. But my heart is telling me otherwise. And what I want to leave your audience with is if your heart is tugging and saying, hey, there's something going on, honor that. ask questions, keep pushing. Don't be deterred by someone telling you no, that you're wrong. A lot of times that intuition is guiding you to the right place. And if you follow that intuition, it will take you to exactly where you need to be with the right information to be guided to take care of whatever challenge is there.
You took the final words right out of my mouth. I was going to ask you for parting advice, and that could not have been any better. Do you mind to tell our listeners where they can connect with you further?
Sure. They can connect with me through my practice, which is Wholistic Kids with a W. So WHOLISTIC Kids. If they do type that into Instagram, Wholistic Kids in Instagram, I've got an Instagram with a bunch of videos there that, touches on these things with, happy case stories that I hope are uplifting. I also have a Substack, so it's my first initial last name, P. Katiraei at Substack, where when time allows, I try to publish, some things. There is actually a mold protocol that's on there that helps guide families with any provider that they want to actually walk through some of this. And it's labeled as for the treatment of autism, but it carries over into multiple other domains, including ADHD. So there's so much that can be done. And, part of my wish with these posts and videos and so forth is just to empower more families to be able to help their kids.
And I will for sure link all of those in the show notes.
Beautiful.
Again, thank you so much for your time today. I have enjoyed this. Thank you for breaking down the complex terms for parents like me to understand.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. So tell me you don't feel like you just had your brain cracked open in the best possible way. I mean, Dr. K basically just said out loud what so many of us feel, but don't have the words for. Our kids aren't broken. They're just living in a world that doesn't exactly make it easy for their little brains and bodies. I don't know about you, but I'm walking away from this feeling way less like the world's worst mom and more like, okay, maybe there's actually a reason behind all of this chaos besides me screwing it all up. And that's huge. So here's what I want you to do. Share this episode with your ride or die mom friend who's also living in the land of ADHD meltdowns and snack wrappers on the floor. Because we're not doing this alone. We're learning, we're laughing, we're figuring it out together, one messy day at a time. Be sure to check out Dr. Katiraei's website, Wholistic Kids, in the show notes to learn more about all of the things we talked about today and so much more. While you're there, hit the follow button so you don't miss what's coming up next. And as always, remember, you're not failing. You're just raising a kid with a brain that runs on its own wild operating system. And that, my friends, takes caffeine. Lots of caffeine and even more patience. That's it for this week on Chaos and Caffeine. Be sure to check us out next week where we'll probably have a lot more of the same chaos and caffeine, but we'll bring a totally new conversation. When you're parenting a child with ADHD or executive function challenges, there is no simple manual. It's hard to know, am I supporting or enabling? How do I set boundaries that build independence and accountability? How do I create consequences that teach and not just punish? World-renowned ADHD specialist Cindy Goldrich is a mental health counselor and founder of PTS Coaching. Cindy and her team of expert coaches teach strategies grounded in brain science and delivered with deep compassion. They help parents move from frustration and confusion to clarity and connection. Because ADHD isn't just about attention. It impacts motivation, emotional regulation, problem solving, and it affects the whole dang family. If you're ready to stop walking on eggshells and start building calm, connected relationships, reach out to ptscoaching.com or check them out in the show notes. If you've got a complex kid and want support that actually helps, this is a great place to start.